30 days. 30 days. That is how long President Trump has in power. And his state of mind after losing has people close to him alarmed. Even Rudy Giuliani opposing an idea to tap conspiracy theorist Sidney Powell as a special counsel to investigate voter fraud. Trump's new pardoned former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, he's encouraging Trump to invoke martial law to overturn the election. With sources telling NBC News the meeting was cut short by Chief of Staff Mark Meadows because it was heading in, quote, an alarming direction. Critics are slamming Trump amid these new revelations. Watch.
This is appalling. There's no other way to describe it. It's unbelievable, almost certainly completely without precedent.
I think it's nuts. The idea of sending the military to rerun it would be a massive, massive red line. And I'm certain the president won't do it, but I think it's certainly worth talking about because people around him are advocating for it.
All right. And Trump ally Chris Christie was blunt in his assessment.
Keep Michael Flynn and Sidney Powell out of the Oval Office, and then those really bad ideas will stay out of the Oval Office as well. I still have not seen the evidence, nor has any court seen the evidence. In fact, every court that has looked at the evidence has not supported these cases. In fact, it's thrown them out. Losing hurts, but in the end, when you get in this game, you understand that that's a possibility. You have to live with it, and you have to move on.
All right, joining me now is the Washington Post's Carol Leonnig, co-author of the bestseller A Very Stable Genius, and Peter Wehner, a contributing writer for The Atlantic. He has worked in 3 Republican administrations, those of President Reagan, Bush 41, and Bush 43. Peter, let me begin with you. Your reaction to that Oval Office meeting on Friday night and all of the news lines that have come out of it.
Deeply disturbing, but not at all shocking. Look, Donald Trump was an open book. This is a man whose sociopathic tendencies have been obvious really before his presidency, certainly manifest during his presidency. And I think it was completely predictable that once he got to the end, this denouement, where he was a loser, which in Trump world is the worst appellation of all, that he would lose power, that he would lose adulation. This would catalyze a whole series of deeply reckless and irresponsible conduct. The question was, what would be the particular manifestations? And we're seeing them play out right now. They're so crazy that Rudy Giuliani doesn't want a part of them, which tells you just how far into this fever swamp that the president is wandering.
Yeah, I was going to say the alarm bells are going off for anyone who's actually watching this. Carol, I'm curious to get your thoughts and what you're hearing from your sources specifically about Trump's state of mind. Where do you think he is these days?
You know, a lot of this entire year has kind of been a slow and bizarre slide for the president. But these final days, according to people inside the White House, are among the most dramatic because the president is now tilting literally at windmills to hear from people who are offering him things that are factually, obviously, demonstrably false, because those are the things he wants to hear, that it's possible to claim he won the election, people who are willing to tell him that it's possible to, as Michael Flynn said, rerun the election. Some of this is really, you know, keep in mind, the president doesn't actually think he's going to be re-inaugurated on January 20th, but some of it is just bragging rights to say that the election was stolen from him so he can continue to beat that drum when he leaves office and when he possibly, as has been intimated, prepares for a run in 2024. He hasn't made that official. There are some people that say he's not interested in that, but clearly he has an interest in being a political voice after January 20th. And claiming that he's not a loser, as Peter points out, is probably paramount. That means he's listening to people that he rejected before, and people who have pled guilty to crimes, and people who have said that the ghost of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela influenced election machines in some way.
So Carol, who do you think is there somebody that is enabling the president? I mean, as others have pointed out, you know, these people can't just walk into the White House. They actually have to be cleared into the White House. So who within the White House, when the president says, I want to speak to Sidney Powell, I want to speak to Rudy Giuliani, is saying, that's a good idea, sir, I'll go ahead and clear them in, as opposed to, as we now kind of know, the Bill Barrs, they're kind of distancing themselves from some of the stuff the president is saying. Mike Pompeo's contradicted him about Russia. Mark Meadows apparently is well at odds with some of these comments. So who is enabling the president?
Well, there are some more junior, less experienced aides. And I think what's interesting about some of them is, a person who used to be his body aide, for example, a body man, continues to be at the president's right hip, helping counsel him. But you're so right in your list of people who had been encouraging some of the more zany things the president wanted to say early on. For example, that his call with Ukraine was a perfect call, even though he was encouraging a foreign president to investigate an American citizen for the benefit of his own election. There are people who were encouraging and helping the president in some of those steps, who even for them, this is a path too far. This is a road too nutty for them to travel with. And that number is swelling while the other number is dwindling.
Hey, Peter, let me play for you something my colleague Joe Scarborough said on Morning Joe today. Watch this.
It is getting actually to the point where you just wonder if we shouldn't just get rid of the 25th Amendment, because in any other time, any other sane time, it would be used to temporarily remove a president from office if he were talking about these sort of things.
Given what we're hearing, Peter, is this something that could be considered?
Well, I think it's too late in the game. I mean, to get the 25th Amendment to kick in is not going to happen. We're just going to have to try and get through these next 29 days and learn from this. This is what happens when you elect someone who is essentially sociopathic and a person who will cross any line, transgress any boundary. And it's an interesting thing. I think people on some abstract level understood that was what Trump was like, and yet when he keeps crossing these lines, I think they're surprised and they're shocked, and they shouldn't be.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.